Okay, so thank you all for being here, and thank you to IFA for doing me the honor to do this talk. Menaka, Harshita, thank you particularly. I think it's customary to start a talk with some disclaimers, so let me put mine to you right away. When IFA first asked me to speak, I wasn't entirely sure I was the right person. And indeed, I'm still not sure, but as you can see, here I am. I'm just actually, often I think of myself as just the girl who can't say no. So here I am. Art isn't my field. I cannot claim to be particularly knowledgeable about it. Research, on the other hand, is something that lies at the heart of all my work. As a writer researching the subjects that she chooses to write about, as an activist seeking knowledge about the issues we are confronted with, and as a publisher who has the good fortune to read multiple research-based works, many by writers from marginalized communities, many works that cross the boundaries of disciplines and constantly subvert what has come to be seen as the canon. Much, or indeed all of this work is in the field of feminism, women, and gender, and it's this experience that I'll draw on in today's talk. While I may not directly address art, what I will try to do through the stories I want to tell you is to look at the ways in which new kinds of research, particularly in the field of the arts, are stretching and expanding, sometimes collapsing the boundaries between what used to be known as the disciplines, how intertwined and overlapping disciplinary boundaries are becoming, and how mutually enriching the methodologies that we now use are. For me, it has been fascinating to look at the descriptions of the many projects that come under IFA's Arts Research Program, for in them I see not only the stretching of boundaries that I speak of, but also something that can lead to a very basic change, or perhaps difference, in the ways we think about knowledge, arts, and research. I want to begin by telling you 3 small stories which shed light on both research and knowledge. The first of these has to do with the title of my talk, which is called Muktabai's Legacy. Some of you may be familiar with Muktabai's story, so I ask for your indulgence when I tell it here. Muktabai Salve was a young Dalit woman who lived in the middle of the 19th century in Maharashtra. We don't know much about her, which isn't surprising. She was young, she was Dalit, she was female. All good reasons for her story to be disappeared. What we do know is that, like millions of young women in India, she had a deep and fierce desire to study, to have an education, but this was denied to her because the upper caste leaders of the time in Maharashtra had decreed that Dalits did not need to study, particularly women, and that all they needed to do was follow the diktats of the upper castes. As it happened, Muktabai got an opportunity to enter a school when 3 people, whose names I think many of us are familiar with, that is Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, and Fatima Sheikh, opened schools for orphans, untouchable girls, and upper caste widows. It was while she was at Savitribai's school that Muktabai wrote a short essay whose title translates in English as On the Grief of the Monks and Mahars. That essay is something like an open letter, generically addressed to the Brahmins, which demands of them why they will not allow her people access to education and, importantly, to knowledge. What gives them the right, Muktabai asks, to monopolize access to knowledge, to monopolize knowledge itself? Not surprisingly, we don't hear anything from or about Muktabai after this. Did she write more? Very likely not. Were her attempts to write more silenced by the powers to be? Very likely yes. But her story leaves us with a fundamental question: who owns knowledge? Who has the right or the access to own knowledge? My second story has to do with another woman, this time in her 30s, who joined the school where Muktabai studied several years later. Her name was Tarabai Shinde. She was an upper caste woman, and because of who she was, she had access to education. Rather like Muktabai, she was also a writer. Rather like her, she only ever wrote one piece of writing, a short tract that was published as a booklet and which was driven by anger and rage. She had read in the newspapers about a widow who had been impregnated by a priest, and when she wanted to abort the fetus, a criminal case was filed against her. The newspapers were filled with abuse for the woman, while no one had anything to say, not one word of condemnation, about the priest who had very likely raped the widow. Tarabai's tract, called Stri Purush Tulana in Marathi, and translated into English as a comparison between women and men, was a searing critique of patriarchy in 19th century Maharashtra, and when printed and circulated, it predictably earned the ire of the patriarchal establishment, not only because she spoke out about the regressive customs of her own caste, but also because she spoke of women as thinking sexual beings. And not surprisingly, we never hear of Tarabai writing anything ever again. For my third story, I want to go further back, about a century, somewhere between 1757 and 1763, to a piece of literature in Telugu, which is titled Radhika Santwanam. It's written by a young woman, believed to be between 18 and 24 years of age. Her name is Muddu Palani, and it was written as a long poem. So Radhika Santwanam tells the story of Radha, Krishna's consort, and how despite being Krishna's lover, she prepares Ila, a younger woman, to be his bride, guiding her in the art of grooming, lovemaking, seduction, advising Krishna on how to please his bride, and suffering heartbreak herself at losing her lover. It is believed that the Radha-Krishna legend allowed Muddu Palani to put forward something that was autobiographical, and the book's value lies as much in that as it does in the open and frank exploration of female sexuality and desire. You may wonder why I'm telling you these stories and what they have to do with the subject of this festival, which brings together 10 years of arts research projects from across the country and across disciplines. My reasoning is as follows. In their own time, each of these women spoke truth to power, and their stories bring to light experiential knowledge, and I want to emphasize that word, experiential knowledge that might otherwise have remained unknown to us. In highlighting caste discrimination, patriarchy, the power of women's voice, the battle for women's education, the institutions set up by people like the Phules, the importance of friendships, the conservativeness of our society, and a subject barely ever addressed, sexual desire, they spoke of this as it was lived and experienced by them. They used their writing, you could call it their art, to make meaning of the world around them, where all they saw was the absence of voices like theirs. Centuries later, the meticulous work of researchers, their motivation and interest, their commitment to locating the hidden histories of women uncovered these histories for us. In doing so, they gave, at least to us as feminists, but I hope to the larger world, a legacy and an exciting and rich history that led us to a crucial question. Why is it that this kind of knowledge is not ever counted as knowledge? Why does it not populate our world and become part of the common sense of our lives? And I want to suggest that some of these questions, which these works push us to ask, form the underbelly of IFA's arts research projects. This is why I was powerfully reminded of these stories when I began to look at the kinds of projects that the IFA Arts Research Program has funded in the last decade and which are the subject of celebration in our 3-day festival. As I read through project after project, I found myself wondering at first, what does this have to do with art? Some of the projects were researching a form of art, it is true, or even the practice of a particular artist, a musician, a singer, but many seem to me to be just research projects. But sometimes you see only what you're used to seeing, and it is when you train the eye differently that you perhaps begin to see other things which were not easily apparent. I saw that by locating themselves under the capacious rubric of art, what these projects were doing was to subvert the very idea of art itself, to take it out of the ivory tower in which it often lived, to take it off the wall of the gallery and into the world, and to give it a completely different meaning. In doing so, the projects were also creating a new and unlikely comradeship, which is richly interdisciplinary and in which new conversations abound, and where the knowledge held by people on the ground is given the respect that it deserves. Also, in choosing the subjects of their research, it seemed to me that many researchers were making somewhat political statements, for example, about the need to document a particular practice because it had been forgotten or ignored by the mainstream, or about working from within your own marginalized community to document knowledge systems within the community because no one else had thought them important enough to do so. And while art was given a different, more democratic meaning, while art was being given a different, more democratic meaning, so also was research. Let me try to explain this by going back a little bit. So for the longest time, the world of research has based itself on a broad demarcation that separates the researcher from the researched. In somewhat simplistic terms, what this means is that those who identify themselves as researchers are seen to occupy some kind of lofty space where knowledge is generated and where theory is expounded. This space carries with it an assumption of neutrality and objectivity. By contrast, the subjects of their research are generally seen as those inhabiting the realm of experience, I put that within quotes, which qualifies them as the field, again within quotes, on which the theory is based. And somehow these two areas get associated with power. One is the realm of the powerful, the other that of the powerless. Because of the way power plays out in the world, and more specifically in the world of knowledge creation, these differences also fit into the assumption that real knowledge is that which is produced in the realm of the powerful. So, for example, in the countries of the West or in urban intellectual centers in our own countries, where it comes to acquire more value and is seen as universal, while we here, that is people on the ground, provide the specifics and the theory, and the theory and practice separation gets played out again. Further categorizations follow on this. Because most academic fields have for long been dominated by men, therefore knowledge produced by men is seen as superior and neutral and universal, even though it may be only about them. And that produced by women is seen as somehow lacking because it is subjective, specific, and small. It follows then that because academic fields are dominated by upper castes, knowledge produced by them is also therefore considered superior, and those on the ground, the knowledge produced by them, not so. This rather simple picture that I have drawn, and of course nothing is ever that simple, has, fortunately for us, begun to change, and the impetus of change comes from the ground up. One such moment of change began in the mid or late 70s, when the feminist movement pushed for the establishing of something called women's studies, much reviled today, but really, to my mind, a radical way of looking at our lives, an interdisciplinary methodology of research that really radically transformed the world of research by saying that research can no longer stop at the threshold of the home, that it can no longer focus only on the public world of the upper caste male. Instead, it needs to cross the threshold, it needs to enter the space of the private realm, of the domestic, and once it does that, what it meets there is very different from what exists in the outside world. The moment you enter a home, which is largely populated by women, you do not necessarily see data and numbers. Instead, you see stories, relationships, emotions, connections, and therefore, new methodologies have to be developed to study them. Another change that came about in research is as a result of caste mobilization as communities on the ground acquired increasing articulation and their stories began to be demanded to be heard, and questions began to be asked about the absence, for example, of studies on caste in mainstream knowledge. These breakthroughs may not have been given the attention they deserve. These breakthroughs may not have been given the attention they deserve, but what they have done is to open up the field of research and to diversify the profile of the researcher. A couple of days ago, I happened to be looking at a manuscript that had been offered to us from this part of the world, It is a collection of stories, myths, legends, tales to do with water, forest, food conservation that has been put together by the manual scavenger communities in Karnataka from within their community. And in the work, local artists have illustrated the wisdom that is passed down orally. And all put together, art and research have come together in a stunning way in this work. And yet none of the writers is a trained writer, none of them is a trained artist, but the work is a work of arts research, I think, in the best possible way. The IFA arts research projects also speak to this change and raise other questions that are important for us as researchers. And I'd like to give you some examples of the kind of subjects that the projects address. Some of you are artists whose work is being showcased here, so this may be a bit repetitious to you, but I'm also thinking that while you know your own work well, perhaps you're less familiar with the comradeship in which it rubs shoulders with other and different work and the works speak to each other. There are projects here that try to trace forgotten histories of music, that look at how the Ghana tradition is morphing into something else. They look at how the Shia community uses the hand of Fatima. They examine the discourse on descent in the Natua Nach form of Bihar. They address the imaginations of the geological, mythological, and fictional time in the desert landscape of the Rann of Kutch. They address the parallel stories of a river and a town. And they address the art of shoemaking or go into something less tangible like the unexplored history of women's pain. And there is just so much here that is so fascinating that to me, these are very, very new directions in research. Each of these projects either tries to find knowledge that has not been explored previously, or it brings a new perspective to existing knowledge, seeing it in relation to other existing forms of knowledge. In this sense, they are truly works of research, but they don't end there. For many projects then go on to think about what to do with this research. What is the output that will be produced? Is it a work of art? How then is that defined? Is the research focused not on seeking material to create a work of art, but researching a lost form of art, or the work of a particular practitioner? Is the research concerned with finding art in works that were not necessarily seen as art? That is, the works of craftspeople or folk artists, works that are sometimes individual, but more likely often collective. These are some of the questions that arise when one looks at these projects. I don't pretend that I have any answers to these questions, or indeed, when we look at the outputs of the projects, their deliverables, if you like, those too are multiple. Sometimes the research leads to a manuscript or a book, as it did to Manish Gaikwad's book. He's in this room somewhere, I think. At other times, to performances, to workshops. Sometimes it results in creating a sound or a print or a digital archive. And sometimes it may even lead to a larger research project, something perhaps like a doctoral thesis that may combine not only the research of art, but also produce a work of art itself. After all, academia itself is opening up to creative forms, being the equivalent of PhD thesis. You can write a novel, for example, and that serves as your thesis. So I want to suggest that this multiplicity of forms and outputs both enriches what we are doing and complicates it, because then, if as artists or practitioners of art, you are seeking, within quotes, legitimacy for your work, and at some stage everyone wants that, there is a tough battle ahead. Because not only do you have to establish the legitimacy of your research and its tools, but also the credibility of the art you are creating, because both are so different from the established forms. There's another question here that I think is important. Traditionally, much research work ends up in institutionalized spaces where either in the form of a library or sometimes, particularly if you're researching the past, in an archive. But in the case of small research projects that come under, say, IFA's rubric, how or what is the ultimate location of those works of research? After the deliverables of, say, music recordings, interviews with artists or communities of artists, the creation of small archives, after all this is done, will it continue to be accessible? Can it be shared? This is a question not only for IFA as an institution that funds arts research, but all institutions that have located themselves in this field. We are creating wonderful works, but how will these be shared? How will the knowledge they have amassed go into the world? And this, I think, brings us back to that dirty but necessary word, money. Because research, and especially arts research, needs funds. The work IFA is doing shows what even a modest fund can help to achieve, but I think we need to think of next steps, and we all know that in the world of art today, there are many discussions about different kinds of archives, so perhaps it's time to push these discussions further and collectively to bring the varied experiences of different arts research organizations together to perhaps help map out future steps. I want now to move on to the next part of my presentation. I want to speak to you for a bit about my own practice, both institutional and individual, to draw out some other aspects of the practice of what we today call arts research. In mentioning these, I want to address some of the other aspects that we find in IFA's concept note on this conference about the pleasure, the disappointment, the excitement, and adding to that a thought of my own, some of the ethical issues that surround the practice of arts research. I'm just going to describe to you two projects that we have done and then close with mentioning a personal reflection on an ethical issue that came up for me as, I suppose I could call myself an arts researcher, but I'm never sure. So in around 2007 in Zuban, we embarked on an ambitious project. One can call it an arts research project, to document a visual history of the women's movement in India by looking at some 40 to 50 years of poster making within the movement. Usually seen as an ephemeral thing, the campaign poster tells a multi-layered story of the movements of which it is a part. It also describes a different and very grounded aesthetic. Our motivation, however, was not to seek out or even to define that aesthetic. Rather, it grew out of our activist involvement in the women's movement. We wanted our history not to be lost. You will recognize this motivation. It's what many of us begin with. In the spirit of feminism, we wanted our project to be truly collaborative, so we involved a wide range of women's groups from across the country, all of whom became stakeholders in the enterprise. Our research question was simple. How had the women's movement imagined itself in the years we were looking at? What would its visual history look like? We knew, as one often does at the beginning of research, that there are resources out there somewhere, and we thought all we needed to do was locate them, and we weren't entirely wrong. For 3 years, we traveled the length and breadth of India, meeting with different women's groups, locating posters, holding workshops, collating our memories, and basically just being on a constant high as more and more material came to light. The IFA note talks about the pleasure and excitement of research, and for all those of us who have done or are doing research, know that there is no excitement quite like that of finding materials you hope to find, and indeed there is no excitement quite like finding material you did not expect to find, and we had plenty of those. Then there were random encounters that sometimes led you in quite another direction. So I want to describe one of these, that while we were hunting for our posters, one day, we had a chance encounter that led to a new avenue of research. In a conversation with a woman called Vijay Srinivasan, who sadly passed away a while ago, who worked with poor communities in Bihar, Vijay excitedly pulled out large swathes of cloth, pieces of Bihar silk, on which were created beautiful, colorful, often funny stories of the battles women had fought. These women had gone to the silk weavers and collected scraps of cloth and leftover bits and pieces and put them together. The stories encompass the stories of fisher women who had earned the right to go out to sea, the stories of ordinary women who, knowing what their husbands got up to, advised them to use condoms to avoid HIV/AIDS. Sometimes the proportion of things were a bit surprising. The condoms that they created out of appliques on silks were often large and extended from the top of the scroll to the bottom of the scroll. And we did not know if this was artistic license or a satirical take on the male obsession with size, but it was definitely one of those. This chance conversation set us on another path, and we began to collect art by rural women that carried feminist messages. That exploration also confirmed for us what we had already known, but now we had evidence in the form of art, that in different corners of India there were women, poor marginalized women, who were creating art to preserve, document, and share the stories of their lives. This is the kind of knowledge that will give every feminist a reason to celebrate. But joyous as our arts research project may have been, it also had some lessons and difficult moments for us. One of the key things, and I know that IFA researchers working on arts projects also face this issue, is how can our research be non-exploitative? For us, it was important to have everyone on board as we saw the history that we were mapping as a collective one. With this in mind, we put in place some measures to address any anxieties people may have had about ownership and acknowledgement, which is a very important part of arts research. That is, who owns the materials we are researching or creating. But it wasn't always easy. Sometimes, with materials created by communities on the ground, it is difficult to know to whom the so-called original belongs or how ownership plays out. The poet Ranjit Hoskote, who gave us some years ago a beautiful translation of the poetry of Kashmiri poet Lal Ded, points out that over the centuries, as Lal Ded's work has come down to us, it has accreted new ideas, and each community who has made the poet their own, Hindu, Muslim, or other, or each age in which her work has been shared, adding to it, transforming it, etc., all of this has resulted in making Lal Ded's work a truly collectively owned work of which there is no original, and it is very, very difficult to know to whom the ownership of this belongs. So how do we deal with issues of ownership in these kinds of traditions, which are so common in our communities? We also had painful moments and some disappointments. Many of the groups we worked with, for example, had for years been completely neglectful of their posters, not storing them properly, not bothering about them, folding them up, letting them be torn, etc. But when it came to parting with them, they became suddenly possessive. So that was something to deal with as well. But if there was possessiveness, there was also generosity. One of our feminist friends was a bit of a hoarder. She hoarded everything she could, political pamphlets, position papers, and yes, posters, and all of them were put in a huge storage box under her bed box. So the first destination for us when we began our search was to go to Vibhuti Patel's bed box. But when we got there, we found something different, which was that Bombay had gone, where she lived, had gone through terrible communal violence. You will remember the violence of the 90s, early 90s, and deeply depressed by what had happened to people around her, Vibhuti had decided to tear up and throw away much of this material that she had. So what we found was only a fraction of what she had actually collected. I'm not going to actually go on to the second project. I'm going to turn now to my last story, which will also allow me to work towards a conclusion. And this has to do with that very important other subject, the ethics of research and the responsibility of the researcher. This is a personal story, and I have spoken about it often. I tell it because the concerns that animated the story still remain with me very much now, and they touch on the themes of our conference. If you heard me speak about it earlier, I apologize. So while research is exciting, I think we, as researchers, we also need to be aware that research and the uncovering of stories and histories that it brings to us is not always an unmitigated good, and can sometimes lead to dilemmas that are very problematic and difficult. So more than 3 decades ago, when I was researching the histories of partition, I was particularly interested in looking at the sexual violence that women had faced. As a feminist, I was determined to uncover this story and to hear it from the women themselves. Initially, try as I might, it was almost impossible to get women to speak about this. Not only did they not want to speak, but they did not have the vocabulary to address a subject like this, how to speak of sexual violence in a society, how to describe sexual violence in a society that doesn't even allow us to talk about sex, doesn't even have the words to talk about sex. Many women had used silence as a way to keep the trauma of those histories at bay. What does the researcher do in situations like this? Do you push the boundaries? Because you do have a kind of power and force speech. So many of the projects in the IFA research program are based on oral history and the use of interviews as a methodology. Our belief is that if we can listen to people speak, we will arrive at the truth of the story we are trying to find. But what if women in particular, do not wish to speak? What does the researcher do then? So it took me a while as a researcher to understand if the silence was the women's choice, I had to respect it, to leave those histories unexplored, but perhaps to use my voice to draw attention to the reason why they had to be left unexplored. And then, as sometimes happens in research projects, I found something, quite by chance, which seemed to me at that time a treasure and would allow me to open up this history. And that was, in a secondhand bookshop in Gurgaon near Delhi, one day I came across a book, which wasn't really a book in the traditional form as a published book might be, but which was something of which perhaps 4, 5, 6 copies had been made, and it was a large tome, that thick, that size, which was a district-by-district listing of women who had been abducted, presumed raped, in Pakistan, and it had been created by the government of India, and there was a similar publication that had been produced in Pakistan. This book had 22,000 names in it. It was like a priceless treasure trove. It had all details of the age of the woman, where she was last seen, who she was last seen by, which family she belonged to, which district she came from, and just that information gave you an understanding of what had happened. But the question before me, because I was beyond excited when I got this book, and to this day, I think there are only 2 copies of this book around. One of them is with me, and I think the other is in a library, perhaps the Central Secretariat Library, I'm not sure. But to this day, that book is with me. And when I started to think about what to do with this book, I realized that if I make that information public, which is what my instinct was telling me to do, put it all on the net and gradually the stories will emerge. But then I asked myself the question, what is the ethical thing to do? Do I have the right to make these histories public? Do I have the right to put them on the net? Because many of these women had families who probably did not know about this, what had happened to them, the violence that their mothers had faced. And was it right for me to reveal this? Of course, you can argue and say that the book is a public document anyway, but it was just that there's only 2 copies of that public document. And then I asked myself the question, do I have the right to hold on to it? Is this knowledge mine to hold and possess? And I still have not found an answer to that question. So I did what I thought was the ethical thing, which is I held on to the book. I still have it. I get so many requests from people to let them look at it, and I hide under the table each time I get such a request. I don't want to say no, but I don't want to say yes, and I don't quite know what to do. But I want to tell you this because when I began thinking more about it, after not after IFA got in touch with me, but after I began to get close to some arts projects, I thought that one way, actually, out of this dilemma is for art to address itself to the research or to the information in this book, and for art to find a way to do justice to the women whose memory is there without making them vulnerable. And that actually made me think differently about art and arts research. So I wanted to mention that to you. If there is an artist among you who wants to think about this, we can think about it. I want to leave you now with some last thoughts. Arts research is an exciting new field full of possibilities and pitfalls. Many different institutions across the country are turning to this form of research, and we are learning more about the lives and works of artists and practitioners, especially from marginalized communities. We are recovering forgotten forms and practices of art. We are creating records of the findings, taking the work out to communities, but there are still many questions to which we need answers, questions of ownership, legitimacy, access, of legacies, and indeed of definitions and scope. What do we mean when we speak of arts research? Research on art, research in art, research on the lives of artists and their works, research that seeks to find art that has been denied a place in the sun, or all of these. And as we go into the future, we'll have to face these questions and be prepared for the pitfalls and the pleasures. Now, all of this is serious stuff, so I'm going to close by telling you 2 before and after jokes. And if you don't find them funny, it doesn't matter, but they throw light on the subject we're looking at. So the before joke is like this. I have a friend who many of you may know, and the joke is often told of her. If you know her, you will understand why she becomes the subject of this joke. Her name is Ritika Khera. She does a lot of research. She's an economist, and she does a lot of research into different issues, working with John Drez and various others. And Ritika's friends tell a joke about her that she pitches up in a village with her laptop. And one day she pitched up, and then she saw a man who was grazing his animals, and she said to him, I have a new formula that can help me and help you. I can tell you how many animals you have and their health and everything. How many goats you have? So the goat herd says to her, yes, okay, tell me that. And so she puts an Excel sheet and puts all the formulas in and does her calculation and comes up with a figure which she gives to him. And he takes it, and then after a few minutes, he says to her, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to do this, but you city people are very strange people, because you come here with your machines and formulas, and then you tell us something that we already know. So, I could have told you this, but not only do you tell us that something that we already know, but you're also very ignorant, because he had said to her that if you give me the correct figure, I will give you one of my animals. And I forgot to say, she said to him, I'll tell you how many goats you have. So he says, I've given you this animal, but you don't even know whether it's a goat or a lamb, but actually I've given you a lamb, and you're calling it a goat. So that shows you how ignorant you city people are. So that is Ritika's before joke. The after joke comes from a group of women from UP, from a village called Sitapur. This group of women is a group of 9 women, 7 of whom are village women and 2 of whom are town women, who got together to do research and write a book about their lives. That book, called Sangtin Yatra, was written some years ago, and the women call themselves Sangtins, that is, friends who work together. They tell this story, that a researcher comes from abroad somewhere to do research. And he's coming to a small village in UP, but in order to get to the village, he has to cross a water body. So how does he cross it? The water body has a boatman who has a little now, and he says, come on, I'll row you across. So the man sits down, it has to be a man, sits down in the boat, and then they're rowing, and the researcher thinks, okay, I might as well start my research now because the field is right here with me. So he says to the boatman, hey, have you heard of globalization and capitalism? And the boatman says, what's that? I don't know what that is. So then he says to him, oh, God, you haven't heard of all of this? That means a quarter of your life is gone. So the boatman shrugs. Then a little while later, the researcher says, hey, have you heard of Marxism? And the boatman says, what's that? And he says, my God, you don't even know that? That means half your life is lost. Then a little later, he thinks I may as well be modern, so he says to him, have you heard of feminism? And the boatman says, no, what's that? And he says, oh my God, 3/4 of your life is gone. After a while, a wave comes and the boat capsizes. And the boatman says to him, hey, do you know swimming? So he says, no. And then he says to him, I think your whole life is gone. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for all the signers. It's a tough job to do, and thank you for doing it.